Myself, G. Mahesh Kumar, Assistant Professor of Chemistry. Today, in the environmental sustainability, we are going to discuss about conservation of biodiversity. Today's the topic of discussion is conservation of biodiversity. Coming to the contents that present in the conservation of biodiversity is one is what is biodiversity, what is biodiversity conservation, importance of biodiversity conservation, threats to biodiversity, conservation strategies, international conservation efforts, benefits of conservation, biodiversity conservation, challenges in biodiversity conservation, finally is conclusion. Biodiversity conservation, importance of biodiversity conservation, threats to the biodiversity, conservation strategies, international conservation efforts, benefits of biodiversity conservation, challenges in biodiversity conservation, final is conclusion. Coming to what actually the biodiversity is. Biodiversity is another form, we call it as biological diversity, refers to the range of life forms on the life that are present on the earth. The range of life forms present on the earth. Biosphere comprises of complex collection of innumerable organisms known as biodiversity. Okay, what actually the biodiversity is a complex of all the living organisms present on the earth. Complex collection are innumerable organisms known as biodiversity, which constitutes the vital life support for survival of human race. Okay, it constitutes the vital life support for the survival of human race. Includes millions of plants, animals, and microorganisms. The genes they contain, the ecosystem of which they are in the part. Okay, it also includes the plants, animals, microorganisms, the genes that contain an ecosystem of which they are in the part. Introduction to the biodiversity. In the conservation of biodiversity refers to the variety of life present on the earth, the variety and variability of living organisms, variety of life present on the earth, and the ecological process that sustain it is called biodiversity. Okay, it refers to the variety of life on the earth and ecological process that sustain it is called as biodiversity. Threats to the biodiversity are the factors that contribute to loss or degradation of species, ecosystem, genetic diversity. There are degradation or loss means divided into species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and genetic diversity. Understanding and addressing these threats is crucial for conserving the biodiversity and maintaining the balance of our ecosystem. Understanding and addressing these threats is crucial for conserving the biodiversity and maintaining the balance of our ecosystem. Balance of our ecosystem. Introduction to the conservation of biodiversity. Introduction to the conservation of biodiversity. It refers to the variety of life forms on the earth, including plants, animals, and microorganisms. It involves the protection and preserving the different species and their habitats. It maintains the biological ecosystem and providing the various ecosystem services. What is the importance of biodiversity conservation? What actually the importance of biodiversity conservation is it provides the essential ecosystem services such as air, water purification, soil fertility, climate regulation. Importance of biodiversity conservation is it is ecosystem services such as air, water purification, soil fertility, and climate regulation. Conservation of biodiversity helps in the discovery of new medicines and potential sources of food and other resources. Conservation of biodiversity helps in the discovery of new medicines and potential sources of food and other resources. It enhances the resilience of ecosystem, making them more resistant to disturbances and climate change. It enhances the resilience of ecosystem, making them more resistant to disturbances and climate change. Threats to the biodiversity. What are the threats of biodiversity? One is habitat loss and fragmentation. Habitat loss and fragmentation, climate change, pollution, invasive species, overexploitation, agriculture expansion, deforestation, overpopulation and urbanization, diseases, outbreak. All these are the threats to the biodiversity. Habitat loss and fragmentation, climate change, pollution, invasive species, overexploitation, agriculture expansion, deforestation, overpopulation and urbanization, disease, outbreak. All this comes to the threats to the biodiversity. Habitat loss and fragmentation is due to the deforestation, urbanization, agriculture are the major threats to the biodiversity. Okay, all these threats to the biodiversity, habitat loss and fragmentation, climate change, deforestation, urbanization, agriculture are the major threats to the biodiversity. Pollution, including the air, water pollution, affects of biodiversity by contaminating the habitats and reducing the species population. Reducing the species population. Invasive species that can disrupt the ecosystem and outcompete the native species, leading to the biodiversity loss. Leading to the biodiversity loss. Conservation strategies in protected areas. What are the conservation strategies? Establishing the protected areas such as national parks, national uh, reserves help the safeguard biodiversity and habitat. Protected areas provide the havens for the endangered species and allow for the recovery of population. Protected areas provide safe havens for endangered species and allow for the recovery of population. Effective management and enforcement regulation. Effective management and enforcement regulation within the protected areas are crucial for the biodiversity conservation. These are the effective management and enforcement of regulation within the protected areas are the crucial for the biodiversity conservation. Conservation, sustainable land use. How we are going to use the land by sustainable method. Promoting the sustainable land use practices such as agroforestry, organic farming helps the preserve the biodiversity. Like agroforestry, organic farming practices results in the preserve of biodiversity. Sustainable land use reduces soil erosion, water pollution, habitat destruction. Sustainable land use which reduces soil erosion, water pollution, habitat destruction. Encouraging the responsible logging and mining practices minimize the negative impacts on the biodiversity. Encouraging the responsible logging and mining practices minimize the negative impacts on the biodiversity. Conservation strategies, wildlife conservation. Here, coming to the conservation strategies, illegal wildlife trade, implementing the measures to combat the illegal wildlife trade and poaching the essential for the biodiversity conservation. Implementing measures to combat the illegal wildlife trade and poaching is essential for the biodiversity conservation. Conservation, breeding, and reintroduction programs help in restore the endangered species population. Here, reintroduction programs like which will restore the endangered species population. Wildlife corridors facilitate the momentum of species between fragmented habitats, promoting genetic diversity. Wildlife corridors facilitate the momentum of species between the fragmented habitats, promoting of genetic species. Ecosystem restoration. How the ecosystem restoration by conservation strategies. Restoring the degraded ecosystems through reforestation, wetland restoration, coral reef rehabilitation enhances the biodiversity. Okay, restoring the degraded ecosystems through reforestation, wetland restoration and coral reef rehabilitation enhances the biodiversity. Ecological restoration aims to recreate the functional ecosystem. Okay, the aim of this ecological restoration is to recreate the functional ecosystem, benefiting both the wildlife and human communities. Involving the local communities in restoration effort promotes a sustainable practice and strengthen the conservation outcomes. Involving the local communities in the restoration efforts promotes the sustainable practices and strengthen the conservation outcomes. Education awareness of strategy. Education and awareness in conservation strategy. Educating the public about the importance of biodiversity and its conservation fosters a sense of responsibility. Educating the public about the importance of biodiversity and its conservation fosters a sense of responsibility. Promoting the ecotourism, nature-based activities generate the support for conservation efforts. Promoting the ecotourism, nature-based activities generate the support for conservation efforts. Raising the awareness about the sustainable consumption, reducing the waste helps to protect the biodiversity. Raising the awareness about the sustainable consumption and reducing the waste helps to protect the biodiversity. What are the international conservation efforts like conventions on the biological diversity? One is Convention on Biological Diversity, that is CBD, is a international treaty aimed at conserving the biodiversity. CBD promotes the sustainable use of biodiversity, fair sharing of genetic resources, access to the benefit sharing. CBD, Conservation Convention on Biological Diversity. The parties to CBD collaborate on conservation strategies, research and capacity building initiatives. Parties to be CBD collaborative on conservation strategies, research and capacity building initiatives. International conservation efforts, red list of threatened species. IUCN. IUCN threatened list of species assess that conservation status of species globally. It provides a comprehensive database of species at risk and guide conservation efforts. Here, what IUCN provides, it gives a data. Based on the data, we are going to protect the what are species which are at risk and guide the conservation efforts. Red list is used to identify the priority species for conservation and monitor their population trends. Great Barrier Reef. Case study on Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest coral reef system and UNESCO World Heritage Site. In this climate change, pollution, coral bleaching pose significant threats to the reef biodiversity. Conservation efforts include marine protected areas, water quality improvement, reducing the climate change impacts. Reducing the climate change impact. Amazon rainforest. In the case study of Amazon rainforest is the largest tropical rainforest and home to diverse species. Deforestation for agriculture, mining, logging is a major threat to the Amazon's biodiversity. Conservation initiative focus on establishing protected areas, sustainable land use practices, and indigenous rights comes under the Amazon rainforest. Benefits on biodiversity conservation. Here, biodiversity conservation have the benefits like it supports the sustainable development by ensuring the availability of natural resources. Okay, the main aim of biodiversity conservation is it supports the sustainable development by ensuring the availability of natural resources. It helps in preserving the biodiversity, maintains ecological balance, which is essential for the health and resilience of ecosystem. Conservation of biodiversity contributes to climate change mitigation, adaptation by preserving carbon sinks and regulating the local climates. All these are the benefits. Challenges of biodiversity conservation. Lack of funding, resources pose significant challenges to biodiversity conservation efforts. Balancing conservation priorities with human development needs can be complex and requires careful planning. Okay, lack of funding resources pose a significant challenges to biodiversity conservation efforts. Balancing the conservation priorities with human development need can be complex and require careful planning. Global coordination, political will be necessary to address the biodiversity loss on large scale. Coming to the conclusion of this, conservation of biodiversity is essential for the maintaining the health and resilience of ecosystem. Protecting the biodiversity preserves ecosystem services, support the sustainable development, benefit the human societies. Each individual can contribute to biodiversity conservation through sustainable choices, education, supporting local conservation initiatives. Local conservation initiatives. The references for this environmental sustainability is Robertson, Margaret, Sustainability Principles and Practices, Routledge and Taylor Francis Group 2017. Responsibility for teaching sustainability in context, General of Sustainable Education. These are the two references we are going to follow for the environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.